Viewers, in this session we will be discussing a very important theme, which is the comparative literature and translation. In order to discuss the theme and also to have a broad outlook of the topic, we are having a very eminent panel with us in our studios. I would like to first of all mention a very great scholar from the United States, who is Professor S. Subramaniam Shankar, who is with us. He is there in the right side of me in the middle of the panel. We are also having with us Professor M. Asaduddin. He is a professor of comparative literature and also teaches English at Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. We are also having another scholar with us. He is a Dr. Riaz Latif. He is a translator, art historian and a poet. He teaches at the Wellesley College, United States. Besides, we also have in this panel Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh. He is the Director, School of Translation Studies and Training, Indira Gandhi National Open University. Professor Singh was earlier the Vice Chancellor of Baba Saheb Ambedkar Open University, Gujarat. Besides, he was also the convener, Gujarat Knowledge Consortium. Professor Singh also a very prolific writer, critic and also translator. I extend very hearty welcome to all our eminent scholars here to this studio. I request Professor Singh to further take this discussion on this very important topic, which is comparative literature and translation, especially in the emerging global scenario, and also there is a discussion and debate to redefine the comparative literature vis-a-vis translation. Welcome, Professor Avdesh Kumar Singh ji.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharma ji. As you said, I also consider it a kind of privilege to be in the midst of practicing comparatists and translators from different parts of a world, if I can put it at the moment. So this really becomes a session of comparative literature that is these days seen in the terms of new debate that is going on in United States, particularly the debate that was given a kind of impetus by David Demirash's concept of world literature. Before we go to that, we know that if there is a possibility of comparative study, then the means of achieving this comparative study is through translation. And country like United States offers a different kind of paradigm for comparative literature. South Asia in particular, in India, we have a different paradigm of studying them. So we would begin with a very general issue as to what is happening in comparative literature in United States at the moment.
I'm really happy to be in this panel with all of you. And this is a really great opportunity for me to share some ideas because I consider myself very binational, bicultural. I'm Indian, and I'm lived in the US for many, many years, and I have both these perspectives in mind. And just to respond to what you were saying, Professor Singhji, you brought up Damrosch and Damrosch's book, What is World Literature, which is maybe 10 years ago, I think. In fact, the 10th anniversary of the publication of the book was just this year. And What is World Literature is a very important book. I happen to disagree with it in significant ways, but it brought back into discussion in the United States the term world literature, which had fallen out of favor for about 15 or 20 years. In the undergraduate classroom, and this situation is very different from India, as far as I can understand it, and I think for good reasons it's different in India. But in the undergraduate classroom in the US, you often have classes in world literature where you have these big anthologies, Norton Anthology of World Literature, the Longman's Anthology of World Literature. And they have been around since the 60s. And in the 80s, for different theoretical reasons, these sort of paradigms of literary study were questioned, that you can have these very broad claims of what is world literature.
But by picking up very small segments.
Very small segments, right? So all of classical Tamil literature is represented by Sangam poetry, collection of Sangam poetry, Sanskrit literature is represented by a few sections of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata and something else. And the Islamic world would be some represented. So the model was often well intentioned but problematic, right? So in the 80s and the 90s, this was very much questioned. So one of the things that Damrosch did, and he of course is completely familiar with all the theoretical developments of the 80s and the 90s, but what he did in his book was try to bring that into, and that with some good reasons, I think it was picked up. And I don't want to say it's all Damrosch. There are a number of other people doing it. And the number of reasons why world literature came back into vogue in the United States. And I can say a few words about it. But what I want to really emphasize here is that my own intervention in this, which I made in this recent book that I wrote, is to say that we shouldn't use the term world literature, but I prefer a term that I call literatures of the world. Right? Not world literature, but literatures of the world. And world literature is usually written with capital W and capital L. And I want to write literatures of the world with a lowercase L and a lowercase W.
To underline the plurality.
Plurality of it. So you might say, like, why? Who cares? Why do this? Well, this is what academics do. We get really worked up about very small things, which actually matter later on. Absolutely. And what exactly? I think for me, literatures of the world, as opposed to world literature, says I don't know everything. I'm not going to tell you everything. I'm not going to give you a complete view of the world because that is beyond my capacity as a teacher or a scholar. But what I can give you, because I don't want to go to the other extreme, which is to say, which is one of the results. I don't know how much. One of the results of the theoretical innovations of the 80s and the 90s was to say we can't make any broad claims. Now, I don't want to go to that extreme either. So what I want to say is that we can make some claims. They are provisional claims in the sense that they're claims which we'll make for now, but open to testing.
Absolutely.
And to revision. And we can convey this to our students. There's no need for us to tell our students. There's no need to tell our students that, look, I can only teach you if I give you a complete picture of the world. In fact, we should teach our students to have that it is okay, that knowledge which is aware of its own limitation is also valuable knowledge. So I want to go from world literature to literatures of the world, because to me that both lets me as a scholar think about the relationship between, these are the three areas that I worked in: American literature, African literature, and literature in India. So I want to be able to compare. I want to be able to make claims. I want to be able to think about the connections. But I don't want to do it in such a way as to say, this is a comprehensive picture, right? I mean, I always tell my students, because I never teach world literature. I've taught it when I was a student myself. I had no choice. I had to put bread on the table. I had to teach a world literature class. But I would tell my students, look at this table of contents. Where is the Armenian literature, right? The Armenian literature is not an anthology of literature because Armenians don't have a nation state, right? I mean, there are any number of these West of Bangladeshi literature, right? It's because, so that's the problem with the world literature model.
What is going on in United States, and you critiqued David Damrosch's concept of world literature. For the sake of my audience, I like to mention that this new debate is directly related to the debate that took place in the last quarter of the 18th century in Europe, when against the concept of national literature, two categories or two concepts were put forward: comparative literature and world literature. So in United States at the moment, comparative literature is used for comparative study of literatures, but at the same time David Damrosch and others, they speak of world literature in which the focus is on circulation of a text in different territories. And another thing that he has done that he has done away with the kind of hierarchies that used to exist in the paper that we used to know as world classics. So this is the context that we will have to keep in mind while discussing this particular thing. Asadji, a primary question that often comes up in our minds, that in Europe, comparative literature came in existence as a reaction against national literatures. National literature that was primarily based on the concept of nation, that was governed by one nation, means one geographical entity,
One
one
language.
region, one religion, one race, one language, one literature. And in this context, nation became almost a villain, if I can generalize here. As far as Indian situation is concerned, India had two concepts, many concepts, but primarily two concepts of nation. The debate that is in Tagore and Gandhi. Tagore's concept of nation was informed by the Western notion of nation, and he did not approve of the concept of nation in his lectures in nationalism, because he saw both the world wars as the ugly consequences of nationalisms. Gandhi, on the other hand, was of a different opinion. He said that happy nationalism leads to happy internationalism. So, therefore, the categories like national literature do not become as irrelevant in our South Asian context as they might appear to be in Europe or, say, for instance, in America. Now, how do we who teach comparative literature through translation, for the sake of our students, we have to reconcile this fact that national literature and world literature are not necessarily antithetical the way they are at times supposed to be. So, will you like to say something about that different literatures that exist within Indian context that we at times call as Indian literature, which is nothing but a cluster or corpus of different literatures in different Indian languages or in different South Asian languages. Small departure, the small deviation in the context of what Professor Shankar ji was mentioning. I think our audience will be very much interested. Later on, we will come to the translation part of it also. Asad ji.
Thank you. But in the case of India, in fact, the national literature becomes comparative literature in some ways, because we have so many languages, about 20 to 22 languages with literatures of their own. And we know that there have been some writers who have influenced the literary tradition of many other languages. Take the instance of Bankim Chandra, takes the instance of Sharat Chandra Chatterjee before Tagore. I'll come to Tagore a little later. We find that their works were massively translated into many other Indian languages. You come across people from Telugu, Tamil, and so on, and they will tell you that we have grown up thinking that Sharat Chandra, because the publisher will write Sharat Chandra and not Chatterjee, that we have grown up thinking that Sharat Chandra is a writer in Telugu, a novelist in Telugu. So the translation or the transfer was so seamless, and the consciousness of the writers in several languages were formed through this massive translation of Bengali literature in the early years of the growth of our self-consciousness and so on.
I think you have very beautifully suggested one term that characterizes South Asian situation in general and Indian situation in particular. That is, Indian literature is marked by interrelatedness. Therefore, the comparative mode becomes a suitable mode, but that comparison should not ignore this interrelatedness that is there. That interrelatedness due to geographical contiguity, and this may be because of the same cultural ethos and with some differences, of course, in different literatures and languages. I think when you were discussing that, then I immediately thought of Bhakti literature. I immediately thought how these movements like modernist movements from one part or from one part of the country or from one language, they moved to another language and then they became indigenous in that particular language. I will again come to Professor Sundar. That is very important for us to know, like even American scholarship is divided between American comparatists and those who subscribe to David Demarash's position. Now, David Demarach has given a new dimension by redefining and reviving almost centuries old concept that was almost buried or that was reduced to world classics. Now, people like Dorothy Figueroa, they reject David Demarash's positions, and you also have your reservations against it. Now, if one looks at comparative literature and the reports of ACLA, American Comparative Literature Association, then there is a huge shift, and the shift is that Charles Bernheimer's report speaks of comparative literature in an age of multiculturalism. And just after a decade, 2005-06, Hans Saucy's report comes and it speaks of comparative literature in an age of globalization. This globalization on the surface and in spirit leads to flattening of the, if I can use that much abused term, flattening of the earth, where uniformity is intended, that entire intellectual or literary transaction takes place through one language, whereas multiculturalism had that plurality in it. How do we, because you are part of us,
Right.
how do we reconcile these two tendencies, or should we wait for another few years and wait for ACLA report?
No, let's not wait.
2015-16.
No, let's not wait for the ACLA reports. I think it is interesting, and I was recently at last year at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London for a symposium on world literature, and the interesting thing, which was which was a gathering of scholars mostly from within the UK, but also from other parts of the world. The interesting thing which emerged in this conference was that there was an attempt by scholars within the UK to, because they didn't see themselves as having at the level of teaching doing world literature, but how should we do it? Do we need to do it? Should we do it at all? Maybe we shouldn't do it. Whereas in the United States, it's very much an established. When I say that world literature went out of fashion, I mean to say that it went out of fashion at the level of research and theoretical thinking, not at the level of teaching, because the anthologies were big commercial success, right? So I think we need to think about what is going on at two different levels. What is to me interesting is that world literature, to be very crude about it, and I would want to make a more sophisticated argument if I had the time, but to be very crude about it, world literature is the way in which a global power maps the world.
Excellent.
Right? This is the reason why you don't see it. In India is for a good reason, and maybe we don't, because it's the attempt of the United States as a unipolar superpower to sort of comprehend the world, and that is always an act of hubris and arrogance, because you cannot capture the world in that way.
Absolutely.
Which is why I don't believe in world literature. A much more modest project which would still engage with the world, but without that arrogance, would be to go back to literatures of the world, right? So I would link it to a particular geopolitical. There are many steps one has to go through. I'm being very crude here, but I would, if I had the time, I would want to go much more slowly between this claim about the United States and its global sort of status and the return to world literature. Now, Damrosch is a very thorough scholar, so I don't mean to say that he's at all unaware of these things, but nevertheless, he's also the editor of a Longman's anthology, which is one of the widely circulating anthologies for undergraduate teaching of world literature. So even though he writes this book where he tries to take complicated positions, if you look at the table of contents, it remains fairly conventional. And my point is that in the classroom, when you're instructing, when you're teaching, in a particular kind of a setup, the pressure to reduce, to codify in very simplistic ways is always there. And I have to say, and this I can say only because I am, of course, a university professor who is useless in all respects, except, to produce, because that's one of the things that we should value when we are humanities, people who study the literatures. I mean, it's all right to slow things down. It's all right to say things are not simple. It's our job to make things complicated, because there are lots of other people out there who want to simplify and reduce and say that, it's black and white. It's not black and white. I think what I want to do is to recognize the grays. So that's my job. I mean, it's the job of the politicians and the technocrats to say things are not gray, they're black and white. But I'm quite happy to take the position of saying that I want to complicate things. So the answers are not simple. The world is a messy place, and we should recognize the messiness of the world, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the, and I think so. What I would say is that the world literature, and this was, of course, in the late 18th century, Goethe, the great German writer, was the one who invented the term world literature. And that has to do with a kind of an expansion of imagination in Europe, right? So I think the idea of world literature, which keeps circulating in and out, is often related to the way in which a national culture tries to imagine and comprehend the world around it. And if I think world literature doesn't have the same purchase, the same sort of position within Indian literary studies, it's for a good reason, because there isn't the same push to sort of, comprehend the world in that, and we should not rush to do it. There's no need to do it,
I think very good observations, and even as scholars, we should give up the pretension of being the problem-solving people all the time. The messiness of the world is to be recognized, and that is to be problematized and further problematized, so that we can have at least good questions. To use them as keys to open different locks. I'll come to Professor Asad and Riyaz Saab also, but two very quick questions related to this, because we shall be discussing translation with them. One is that as far as comparative literature is concerned, one thing that is said about comparative literature is that it lost its identity because it started doing everything, whatever was available, from new humanities to film studies to oral and this and that. So did it really affect the identity of comparative literature? And second thing is that it did everything, but it abandoned comparative poetics, at least in the American comparative literature scenario, wherein Richard Rorty has only 3, 4, I think 5 pages on literary theory. Whatever happened to comparative poetics? Is there some politics behind it?
The 80s theory, sort of the most sort of cutting edge theoretical from France, and were actually made their way into the US Academy through departments of comparative literature. In the sense that, not that we shouldn't read literatures of English, for the reasons that has already been mentioned, that the literatures of India is the comparative literatures of India, and there is really no need, without doing discredit to a great tradition of writing in English, both in Britain and in the United States, there's no need to sort of continue to put it at the center of literary study. And I think there are ways in which we can much more. So that would be, I would also say that, and here is where I think context is important. If you think about comparative literature in a global context, it's one thing. If you think about comparative literature in a national context, it's another thing. And it's not necessarily always the same. It raises similar methodological questions for us, at the level of method and how we study. I think there are some things which are particular to what one can call comparativism as a method. And there are similarities, right? And but also they're not exactly the same thing. I always like to say that India is a nation in translation. I mean, without any exaggeration. I don't just mean in a panel like this, I'm a Tamil speaking person who does his professional work in English, who's walking around in Delhi speaking in Hindi, right? So, I mean, all of us lead these lives of translation. I tell my students in the United States, who are by and large monolingual, right, that my niece in Hyderabad knows 4 languages for no reason except that she lives in Hyderabad. She's Tamil, she speaks Tamil at home, she knows Telugu, right? She knows Hindi and she knows English. So we are a nation in translation every single day in multiple ways, and this is something which we need to really sort of acknowledge and consider one of our, sort of one of the distinctive and really powerful things about us. And it's an incredibly important thing. But I think we haven't, and I'm happy to be corrected, I think we need to do a lot more work to understand this. I think we haven't fully theoretically engaged this. We haven't fully engaged what it means in as thorough a way as possible. And this is where translation studies would be.
Asad Sahab, I would relate to a point that he mentioned, and that's shared by all of us, that India is a nation in translation, or Indian consciousness is basically translational consciousness. That even unconsciously we are translating. But there is a kind of heavy point at the back of my mind, and I can't resist the temptation of asking this thing to you. One would be like, what do you think of contemporary translational practices in our country? Particularly like even translation from Indian languages to Indian languages, that is primarily like people wish to get translated into English, or that's one. But related to that is how to teach a translated text in a classroom. This is an issue that has been bothering me. Though it never bothered me when I taught Plato, Aristotle, Longinus, Horace in my literary criticism classroom, because I thought that they wrote in English initially, which was not the case. So how should we, particularly I would say at UG level or at the PG level, how should we receive a translated text, one, and how should we teach it, so that these students who are in front of us do not suffer from any kind of what I would say literary prejudice, that this is translated, not original. Since you have been doing it and you are a translator yourself, we need your observations for this particular thing.
Yes, we have been studying and teaching translated text without being self-conscious about them, because they masqueraded as English texts for us. The entire tradition, not only of Greek and Roman classics, but even the tradition of Russian fiction, which influenced Indian fiction writers in a massive way. The entire tradition of French fiction. And now you have a theory that has flooded the market. If you go back, you will find most of the foundational texts have been written either in French or German. French feminist theory. Indian academics, they would make large claims for themselves about being theorists, but they have got their knowledge and understanding of those texts, reading the translations. And now we find that if a scholar is capable of looking at both the original and the translated text, he tells us that, look here, in German, this phrase could have been translated in a different way. This preposition, if you just change the position of the preposition or postposition, the interpretation will be different. So I thought that without some insight into the original, reading translated text as though they were written in the receiving language or the target language is reductive, sometimes self-defeating. Now, the actual question in the classroom pedagogy demands that you have to homogenize, you have to classify, as Shankar has pointed out a little while ago. And in a country like India, if we are studying Indian literature, it can't be expected that the teacher will be competent in several languages of India at the same time. But the minimum, what I try to do in my class, that if I am teaching a text that was originally written in Bangla or Assamese or Urdu or Hindi, I'd like to familiarize myself with the tradition of that language, the history from which the text stemmed, and the context particularly, because the context becomes important. While you translate not only the narrative, not only the language, but you also translate the culture, but side by side with this, you also try to attempt the context, because things, they make their sense in a particular context. You are snatching a text from a particular context and you are trying to recontextualize it in another tradition. So particularly academically speaking, in the classroom, I attach great importance to translators who have been self-conscious about the text, and they would write a large introduction trying to give us the background of the text, the tradition it comes from, and so on. And in the translation itself, there may be pointers. And Shankar, you have translated water, I suppose, from Tamil. You would be familiar with this. That earlier the assumption was that a translated text should be fluent. It should read like the original text. But the current insight is that if it reads like the original text in the target language, then the very purpose will be defeated, because it will do so through flattening out the most important cultural angularities of the text. So in the practice of translation itself, those cultural points need to be underlined, they need to be signaled, and in the introductory essay or the translator's note or afterward, whatever, the translator should try to point out why these cultural markers are there. So that would make the study of a translated text in the classroom meaningful, more fruitful, rather than teaching it as though the translated text were a text in English.
Excellent. I think Professor Shankaran would have something to add to this.
Yeah, I want to add two things. Excellent points by Asad, but I want to, and these are two things which again, are very, very important to my thinking, and I've sort of worked them. So if I've been working with these ideas in the last few years. One is that translation is interpretation. For me, translation is interpretation. What do I mean by that? I mean by that something like this. If I were to write an essay on Chinua Achebe's great African classic, Things Fall Apart, I write a critical essay about it, I'm interpreting the novel, and by definition, my interpretation can be challenged. Somebody else can come and say, Shankar, your interpretation of Things Fall Apart is not quite right here. Your reading of this passage is not quite right. Your analysis character is not quite right. So the act of interpretation is always understood to be in dialogue with others. It is by definition provisional, right? It's part of a communal debate. I think we should treat translation in the same way. We tend to treat translation as if it is singular. That is why we have this old problem in translation studies, which is completely boring to me, which is whether it is faithful or not, right? Is this translation of this text faithful? Is it not faithful? And to me, it is a perfectly, it's a dead end, because of course you're always going to debate, and nobody, it's not even a problem that we should take on. I'm not even going to try to, but what I'm going to say is that if you have my translation of Komal Swaminathan's great play Tanneer Tanneer into as water is one interpretation of that play, and that is how it should be understood. And as an interpretation, other readers of Tamil, not other people who don't read Tamil won't be able to do it, would be able to say, well, here his Shankar's translation understood as interpretation is good or not good, is defensible or not defensible, right? So that is something which can be done. So the first point I would say is that translation as interpretation, which is an old debate in translation studies. If you go back 100 or 150 years, you will see this debate keeping on returning, and different people. So this is not at all something new which I'm saying. I mean, George Steiner says this, and you can go back many, many decades of debates within translation studies about the fidelity question, and one way to approach it is that translation is interpretation. That's one thing which I would say. And when we understand it as interpretation, then we no longer, the debate will remain. but it shifts to different grounds. It's no longer about whether you got it right or wrong at the level of, because it will always, no, you cannot anybody who's translated knows this. You cannot take a text from one language and completely move it over into another language. It's impossible, right? But that doesn't mean that translation is not valuable. So that's one thing which I would say. The second thing, picking up on what Asad is saying about the introductions and the footnotes, is something that I like to, and this panel itself is an indication of this, is something that I think of as a culture of translation. I think we need to develop a culture of translation. What do I mean by that? I think we need to make publishers, editors, readers, scholars, reviewers aware of the kinds of issues that we're talking about here, right? So that, and I'll return to my American context, so that when a translated French novel is reviewed in the most powerful review venue in the United States, which is the New York Times Book Review, if you have a culture of translation, the fact that it's translated is absolutely a part of the review process. And the readers who read it also fully acknowledge it. I think that culture of translation, if we do it in a very broad way, will itself change the debate. Now, it's a really, really hard task, because it's changing the person on the street who wants to read and say, look, you're reading Flaubert's Madame Bovary in English, read it, enjoy it, but be aware that it's a translation and therefore it's an interpretation. I think we need to really sort of make that idea, and it's all right. It's not an inferior thing. It is not a less authentic experience to read Flaubert that way or Bankim Chandra that way.
We have Riaz Saab with us. Now the debate or this discussion needs different orientation, because Riaz Saab is a poet as well as a translator. Poets often do not like the way their poetry is taught in the classroom. Often it is said that the teachers murder poetry in the classroom. Now, you are a translator also. Now, how will you like your translation to be taught in the classroom? Or your observation about, because I see you as a kind of more objective participant in this debate.
Thankfully, my poetry is never taught in classrooms. I'll retrace my steps back a little and listening to all of you. And I think there are some very significant motifs which have kind of emerged from the debate, and which one most important thing is the cultural component which always accompanies the act of translation, or the act of mediation, so to speak. I think I would like to use that term, and I'm kind of segueing a little. I mean, I'm not answering your question at the moment, but I think it definitely has its kind of effect on what ultimately turns out to be that final product, and which should be kind of let loose in the open realm, so to speak, in a certain way. Or so oftentimes, I mean, to come back to what would I prefer being taught in the classrooms, oftentimes it's a double-edged sword for me in a way. What happens is, if I attempt a translation of my own poem sometimes, right? Sometimes I feel it is bang on mark. It reads much better in English, because I think there are, and I think each word is it's accompanied by cultural baggage, so to speak, and there are certain ideas or certain concepts that you might unconsciously want to convey. The English, for instance, has a better kind of, and vice versa. There's a whole body of text which is, in quotes, untranslatable, right? So you're always kind of swinging back and forth with this tensions, and that also kind of brings into the play, let's say, a third entity, a different translator, for instance, and oftentimes you find that he or she can do much better justice to your work than you yourself can do, and sometimes the other person can completely mess it up.
Riaz Saab is saying, he is responding to a question that we often ask: who is the most suitable translator? Is poet himself or herself the best translator? Perhaps he says that's a myth.
Sometimes, it just works well, and it's perfectly there. I mean, there's no rational way to kind of really after a point there's no rational way to explain it. It just feels as if this just looks and sounds right. It might not be faithful. I mean, that's all secondary probably. And sometimes you just know that after all the several attempts, it's there's something which is kind of missing. And which someone else can probably set it right. So it's kind of a very weird dynamic, I guess. So.
In fact, I thought we didn't ask this, we didn't leave any space for the principal stakeholder to ask a question. That is, how will students like to be taught as far as the translated text in the classroom are concerned? One of the most important thing these days discussed in Indian academic circles is that what should be the model of comparative study which is based on translation studies. I would request Asar Saab to throw some light on some of them, particularly Tagore's concept of Vishwa Sahitya. I will not call it world literature, though he towards the end of that speech he said that I would call comparative literature. Vishwa Sahitya, he equates world literature to comparative literature. Since you have read Tagore and this essay as well, our students will be much benefited with your insights.
He calls it Vishwa Sahitya, but the way he formulates it is, one finds that all the necessary underpinnings of comparative literature are in play there. So maybe at that time, this Tulanamulok Sahitya, which will be the Bangla translation for comparative literature, it was not in currency. The term that he could coin is Vishwa Sahitya, which is literally translated as world literature. But right through the essay and in his other writings as well, he makes a very strong plea for not remain confined within the parameters of a single language, a single defined territory, a concept of a single culture or unified culture or uniformity and so on. It is absolutely in sync with his broad idea of humanism and internationalism. And Tagore was, if there is a bad word in Tagore's dictionary, it is nationalism. Because right through essays after essays, he talks about nationalism in such derogatory and pejorative terms and warns us against the danger of that narrow nationalism. His works too, for example, this novel Gora. Gora is the first novel that perhaps, to my knowledge, conceptualizes India as a nation.
True.
Otherwise, earlier, if we had a Tamil novel, you had the Tamil cosmology there and the Tamil nationalism. If you had a Bengali novel earlier, in case of Bankim Chandra or in case of Sharat Chandra, their concept of the nation does not extend much beyond the borders of Bengal, except in a very abstract way. It's for the first time we find that in this novel, Gora, the central character is, or the central characters, Gora and Naveen, they are repeatedly asking this question, that what is this entity called Bharatvarsha? What is this nation?
True.
And if there is any dialogic novel in the real sense of the term, it is Gora. Even now, you find this dialogue getting on, and you are never bored. Normally, what happens if someone is driving a point home in a narrative, you tend to get bored. But here, the conversations, the dialogue is so interesting that you hardly get bored. And right through the novel, and again it is the purpose of comparative literature also, that right through the novel Tagore makes a plea through his character for plurality, for inclusiveness, for also recognizing one's limitations. He interrogates Bengali culture of the time, Bengali literature of the time, which in fact masqueraded as Indian culture or Indian literature. Bengalis at that point of time were very, very aggressive. If they want to translate, they will translate Latin American literature.
Not
The latest work of Latin American literature or French literature. They won't look at their backyard, what is happening in Assamese literature or Oriya literature
or Hindi.
or Hindi. It is only now, perhaps, that this shift is taking place. Coming back to Professor Avdesh's question about translation among or between our own literature, and this needs to be highlighted, I suppose, underlined. Because before independence and immediately after independence, we find that there was significant amount of translation that was taking place among Indian languages. But that stream of translation you find gradually and slowly drying up. We now mainly translate from our own languages into English. Turning one assumption of translation studies on its head, that one translate into one's own language. We are always translating from our languages into a language that we have acquired. But then again, perhaps here there is some food for thought. As Ijaz Ahmad makes the remark in his essay on Indian literature, that perhaps in future the largest archive of Indian literature will be done in English language. Look about Dalit writing, Adivasi writing, any other marginalized writing. What happens when someone writes a Dalit novel in Tamil or Marathi and so on? It remains confined within that region. The print run is 200, 300. The publishers do not find it viable. After the first print comes, then after 5 years or 6 years or 10 years, if you want to locate the book, you won't be able to locate the book. It will disappear from the market. So we find that even in women's studies, the solidarities are built across Indian states and regions through translation into English.
Before they think
Yeah.
of a question, I would add to what Asadji said. He very rightly mentioned that the Tagore's model of comparative literature is based on his humanism, and that is reflected in the sense that he thinks of comparative literature as a building without any architectural design, unfortunately, Riyasa. Different writers are contributing to that building with their works. Whatever is of sustaining interest that remains there, rest falls off.
Right.
Why I'm saying this is that this model of world literature or comparative literature is more inclusive and more progressive, because this model does not ask you what is your nationality, what is your religion, what is your language. So the great time becomes the decider.
Yeah.
So this is what I think is amongst different models, wherein we can say that India in Indian languages there are quite a few models that can also be explored.
I think we have covered a very large, area of discussion under the topic which we announced in the beginning, that is the comparative literature and translation, where we began with the world literature and then literatures of the world, and also especially one point which really struck to me, that translation can also be very seriously understood as interpretation, and also from the Indian scenario and the translation amongst Indian languages, and also translations from the West into Indian languages. Well, looking at the gamut of the topic, we need another session. So we hope to meet again and further continue this discussion. But I would like to thank our panelists, especially Professor Shankar, Professor Astuddinji, Professor A.K. Singh and Professor Riaz, for having shared their views with us. and also giving us new insights, especially to the students of translation studies, because till now we had been putting things in a different order. Now I think we'll be having more clarity in understanding, and also dealing with the challenges that we come across during our activity, during the act of translation study. Once again, I thank you very much, and also I thank all our colleagues and also the viewers at our regional centers and other networks. So we take and say goodbye here, and we hope to meet you again and also carry forward this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharma.
Thank you.
All of us, thank you.